She was left for dead in wasteland, but I took her in and cleaned her up. In the heart of a forgotten, crumbling outpost, Ethan Kael finds something that shouldn't be there. A mysterious, silver-skinned alien woman, battered and broken. What started as an act of mercy soon turns into something far deeper, a bond forged in the fires of survival, as Ethan uncovers more about her than he ever expected. But survival isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about confronting what's buried inside. Curious about what happens next? Don't miss out on the adventure. Subscribe to Alien Whispers for more intense, gripping sci-fi stories. The wind in Sector 13 howled like a dying machine, carrying the acrid tang of rust and scorched metal through the air. It was a forgotten corner of the universe, a graveyard of ambition where the skeletal remains of research stations jutted from the ground like broken teeth. Once this place had pulsed with life, scientists in pristine coats, machines humming with purpose, the promise of discovery lighting up the void. Now, it was a wasteland of shattered concrete and twisted steel, the echoes of war etched into every cracked surface. Ethan Kael's outpost sat on the edge of this ruin, a squat, crumbling structure patched together with scavenge panels and stubborn will. Inside, the air was thick with the hiss of leaking pipes, tendrils of steam curling upward to mingle with the dim, flickering glow of a single overhead light. It was a place that mirrored the man who lived there, isolated, worn, and clinging to survival. Ethan Kael was no stranger to desolation. At 42, he carried the weight of too many years and too few victories. His hands, calloused and scarred from a lifetime of wrenching machines back to life, moved with a mechanic's precision, though they hadn't touched anything worth fixing in months. His face was a map of hard lines, deep creases around his eyes, a jaw shadowed with stubble, and a brow that seemed permanently furrowed. The war had taken everything from him: his squad, his family, his purpose. What remained was a man who'd retired not by choice, but by necessity, retreating to this abandoned station to let the universe forget him. Yet beneath the rough exterior, there was a quiet magnetism, a strength in his broad shoulders, a flicker of something unyielding in his gray eyes that hinted at the soldier he'd once been. He was hunched over a workbench, tinkering with a rusted circuit board when the sound came. It wasn't much, just a faint scrape against the debris outside, barely audible over the wind's relentless whine. Ethan paused, his wrench hovering mid-turn, ears straining. Sector 13 was a dead zone. No one came here unless they were lost or running. He set the tool down, wiped his hands on his grease-stained pants, and stepped toward the reinforced window. The glass was scratched and cloudy, but through it he could make out the jagged silhouettes of collapsed towers and the faint shimmer of something moving in the rubble. Curiosity tugged at him, sharper than it should have been after years of apathy. Grabbing a flashlight from the shelf, he pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the cold. The beam of light cut through the haze, illuminating a landscape of destruction. Piles of broken machinery loomed like forgotten monuments, their edges softened by dust and time. Ethan moved cautiously, boots crunching against the gravel, his breath fogging in the chill. He'd seen enough bodies in his life to know what death looked like, and he half expected to find another casualty of this forsaken place. A scavenger too desperate, a refugee too weak. But what he found stopped him cold. There, sprawled across a slab of shattered concrete, was a figure unlike anything he'd ever seen. She lay motionless, her body half buried in the debris, as if the earth had tried to claim her. Her skin was a shimmering silver, catching the flashlight's glow like liquid metal, smooth and unbroken despite the filth clinging to her. Long, dark hair fanned out around her head, tangled with ash and grit, framing a face that was both delicate and fierce. Her eyes were closed, but even in stillness, they seemed to hold a light of their own, bright, almost luminous, beneath lids that fluttered faintly. She was small, her frame fragile, yet there was a grace to her, a quiet beauty in the curve of her neck, the gentle slope of her shoulders. Her clothes, if they could be called that, were little more than tattered rags, barely covering the contours of her body, leaving her exposed to the biting wind. Ethan stood there, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. His first instinct was to turn away. This wasn't his problem. He'd spent years building walls around himself, shutting out the world and its endless pleas for help. Whatever she was, human, alien, something else, she didn't belong here, and neither did his pity. But then her chest rose, a shallow, ragged breath breaking the silence, and something inside him cracked. He saw himself in that moment. A younger Ethan bleeding out in the wreckage of a battlefield, waiting for someone, anyone to care. No one had come for him then. He'd clawed his way back alone. But she wouldn't survive the night out here, not like this. He dropped to one knee beside her, the cold seeping through his pants. "Hey," he said, his voice rough from disuse, barely carrying over the wind. "Can you hear me?" She didn't stir, but her lips parted slightly, a faint exhale brushing against his skin as he leaned closer. The warmth of her breath grazed his neck, soft and fleeting, and Ethan froze. A shiver ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something he couldn't name. It was a sensation both tender and unsettling, stirring a heat in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Her scent hit him then, faint beneath the dust, a strange, earthy sweetness that didn't belong in this wasteland. Up close, her beauty was almost unbearable, the silver of her skin glinting like starlight, her features sharp yet soft in a way that pulled at him. He shook his head, forcing the thought away. This wasn't the time. She was hurt, maybe dying, and he was no hero, just a man too stubborn to let another soul slip away. He reached out, hesitating as his fingers hovered over her arm. Her skin looked impossibly smooth, and for a moment, he wondered what it would feel like, cool like metal or warm like flesh. The question lingered, unbidden, as he finally touched her, his rough hand brushing against her shoulder. She was cold, too cold, but alive. That was enough. Ethan slid his arms beneath her, lifting her carefully from the rubble. She was lighter than he'd expected, her body fitting against his chest as if she'd been made to rest there. The contact sent another jolt through him, her closeness pressing against the edges of his carefully guarded solitude. He gritted his teeth, shoving the feeling down, and turned back toward the outpost. The wind whipped around them, tugging at her hair, and as he carried her through the threshold, the steam from the station's pipes rose to meet them, curling around her silver form like a shroud. He kicked the door shut behind him, the sound echoing in the quiet, and moved toward the workbench, her weight a steady presence in his arms. Ethan's boots thudded against the metal floor as he carried her into the station, the door slamming shut behind him with a hollow clang. The air inside was warmer, thick with the damp heat of leaking pipes, but it did little to ease the chill radiating from the silver-skinned woman in his arms. Her body pressed against his chest, light yet solid, her head lolling against his shoulder as if she'd surrendered to exhaustion. The sensation was disorienting. Her closeness stirred a protective instinct he thought he'd buried long ago, tangled with a flicker of confusion he couldn't shake. She was a stranger, an anomaly in this dead place, and yet holding her felt strangely right, like a piece of machinery slotting into place after years of disrepair. He tightened his grip, his jaw clenching as he navigated the cluttered space. The station was a mess of shadows and spare parts, lit only by the faint amber glow of a flickering bulb. Ethan maneuvered past a stack of rusted tools and a cracked monitor, his breath steady but heavy. He could feel her heartbeat, faint and erratic, pulsing against his ribs through the thin fabric of his shirt. It was a reminder she was alive, fragile, but fighting, and that alone kept his legs moving. He reached a narrow cot shoved against the far wall, a relic from his early days here, its surface worn but clean, and lowered her onto it with care. Her body sank into the padding, her silver skin catching the light in a way that made her look almost ethereal, a stark contrast to the grime-streaked world around them. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants, and stared at her. Why was he doing this? The question gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. He'd spent years perfecting the art of detachment, turning his back on the galaxy's endless parade of suffering. Sector 13 was his refuge, a place where no one asked for help because no one came. Yet here he was, dragging this whatever she was into his sanctuary. His mind screamed at him to walk away, to dump her outside and let fate decide. But his heart, damn it, wouldn't let go. It wasn't just pity. It was something older, a memory of screams he couldn't silence, of hands he couldn't reach in time. He'd failed too many people before. Not her. Not tonight. Ethan turned to a dented cabinet, rummaging through it until he found a rag and a canteen of water. The station's purifier still worked, barely, and he kept a small stash for emergencies. Disqualified, he supposed. He poured some into the rag, the liquid cool against his fingers, and knelt beside her. She hadn't moved, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Up close, her features were even more striking. High cheekbones, a delicate jaw, lips parted just enough to show a hint of teeth. He hesitated, the damp cloth hovering over her arm. She was filthy, covered in ash and dust, but beneath it, her silver skin shimmered like polished metal. He didn't know what she was, alien, experiment, survivor, but she was alive, and that was where he'd start. He pressed the rag to her forearm, wiping away the grime in slow, careful strokes. The dirt came off easily, revealing more of that luminous silver beneath, smooth and unbroken. His hand trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from the feel of her, cool at first, then warming under his touch. He moved to her shoulder, brushing the cloth along the curve where her neck met her collarbone, and a jolt ran through him. Her skin was softer than he'd expected, almost silken, and the contact sent a rush of heat up his arm. He froze, his breath catching as the sensation settled low in his chest, a mix of curiosity and something he refused to name. Her scent drifted up again, that faint, earthy sweetness cutting through the station's stale air, and it made his head swim. Ethan pulled back, shaking his head as if he could dislodge the feeling. This wasn't right. She was hurt, vulnerable, and he was no lecherous fool. He turned away, focusing on the canteen instead, splashing more water onto the rag to keep his hands busy. The memory hit him then, unbidden, his last mission, the one that broke him. He'd been too late, always too late, watching his squad vanish in a blaze of fire and smoke. The guilt had carved itself into him, a wound that never healed. Caring for her now, even in this small way, felt like a quiet rebellion against that failure, a chance to prove he could still save something, someone. He returned to her side, steeling himself, and resumed cleaning her other arm. The rag glided over her skin, tracing the faint lines of muscle beneath, and he kept his movements deliberate, mechanical. But when he reached her hand, her fingers twitched, curling slightly as if reaching for him. Ethan paused, his pulse quickening. Her eyes were still closed, her face slack, but that tiny movement sent a shiver through him. He brushed the cloth over her knuckles, his thumb grazing her skin by accident, and the heat flared again, sharper this time. It wasn't just her beauty. It was the life in her, fragile yet stubborn, pulling at him in ways he couldn't explain. He moved to her face next, wiping the dust from her cheeks with a gentleness he didn't know he still had. Her lashes fluttered, long and dark against her silver skin, and for a moment he thought she might wake. She didn't, but the possibility hung there, heavy in the air. Ethan's hand lingered near her jaw, the damp rag forgotten, as he studied her. She was a mystery, a contradiction, weak yet resilient, alien yet familiar. He wondered what her story was, what had left her here, but those questions could wait. For now, she needed him, and that was enough to keep him going. He stood, tossing the soiled rag onto the workbench, and grabbed a thin blanket from a nearby crate. The station's heater sputtered in the corner, its faint hum filling the silence as he draped the fabric over her. She shifted slightly, a soft sigh escaping her lips, and Ethan watched her for a moment longer, his hands flexing at his sides. The canteen sat empty on the floor, the damp rag still warm from his grip, and he bent to pick it up, his shadow stretching across the room as the light flickered overhead. Ethan set the canteen down with a soft clink, his eyes lingering on the silver-skinned woman now draped in the blanket. She looked smaller on the cot, her fragile form swallowed by the coarse fabric, but the faint rise of her chest told him she was holding on. The station's air hung heavy around them, thick with the damp warmth of steam hissing from the pipes overhead. He couldn't leave her like this, covered in grime, her body a map of the wasteland's cruelty. She needed more than a rag and a quick wipe down. He needed to do this right, even if it meant stepping closer to a line he wasn't sure he wanted to cross. He crossed the room to a rusted panel near the workbench, flipping a switch with a practiced flick of his wrist. A low groan rumbled through the walls as the station's old water system sputtered to life. It wasn't much, a makeshift bath rig from a salvage filtration tank, but it still worked, drawing from a buried reservoir he'd tapped years ago. He dragged the dented metal basin from its corner, the scrape of it against the floor echoing in the quiet. Steam coiled upward as he poured hot water from a jury-rigged heater, the surface rippling with heat. He tested it with his fingers, wincing at the warmth, then added a splash of cold to temper it. It wasn't luxury, but it would do. He turned back to her, hesitating. She hadn't stirred, her breathing still shallow, but the blanket had slipped slightly, revealing the curve of her shoulder and the silver gleam of her skin. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry despite the humidity. "Hey," he said softly, his voice rough against the stillness. "I've got water ready. It'll help." No response, just a faint flutter of her lashes. He stepped closer, kneeling beside the cot, and gently shook her arm. Her skin was warmer now, softer under his calloused fingers, and the contact sent a quiet tremor through him. Her eyes flickered open, bright and piercing even in their haze, locking onto his with a clarity that made his breath hitch. She didn't speak, but she shifted, pushing herself up with trembling arms. The blanket fell away, exposing more of her, tattered rags clinging to her frame, barely concealing the lines of her body. Ethan averted his gaze, heat creeping up his neck, and gestured toward the basin. "Over there," he muttered, standing to give her space. She moved slowly, her steps unsteady, and he resisted the urge to help, sensing she needed this moment to herself. When she reached the edge of the bath, she paused, her fingers brushing the rim as if testing its reality. Then, with a quiet resolve, she shed the rags, letting them drop to the floor in a crumpled heap. Ethan turned away, busying himself with a stack of tools on the workbench, but the sound of water sloshing pulled his attention back. She stepped into the basin, sinking into it with a grace that belied her weakness. The water lapped against her silver skin, washing away the dust and rivulets, revealing the full shimmer of her form. A soft moan escaped her lips, low, almost inaudible, but it hit Ethan like a punch. It wasn't pain. It was relief, raw and unguarded, the first sound of life she'd given him. Then came the tears, silent at first, then breaking into choked sobs that echoed through the station. She hugged her knees, her shoulders shaking as the warmth enveloped her, a shield against the cold she'd endured too long. The sound clawed at him, dragging up memories he'd fought to bury. He saw his sister's face, pale and still in the wreckage of their colony, her cries fading into nothing. He saw his squad, their voices lost in the chaos of battle. Each sob from her was a knife twisting in his chest, a reminder of every time he'd been powerless to stop the pain. He gripped the edge of the workbench, knuckles whitening, and forced himself to stay where he was. She didn't need him hovering, didn't need his pity. This was her moment, her reclaiming of something lost, and he wouldn't take that from her. He stared at the tools, tracing their familiar shapes with his eyes, anything to anchor himself against the ache. But then the steam thickened, curling through the air like a living thing, and his resolve faltered. He glanced over his shoulder just for a second, and the sight stole his breath. Through the haze, her silhouette shimmered, water tracing the arch of her back, the curve of her hips, her silver skin glowing as if lit from within. She leaned back, letting the warmth soak into her, and the vulnerability of it, the trust in that simple act, tightened something in his chest. His heart thudded, loud in his ears, and the room felt smaller, the air heavier with heat and something unspoken. He snapped his gaze away, cursing under his breath, and rubbed a hand over his face. She was a stranger, a survivor, not some fantasy for him to gawk at. Yet the image lingered, burned into his mind, and he couldn't shake the pull it stirred in him. She stayed in the bath longer than he expected, the water growing still as her sobs faded. When she finally moved, the slosh of it drew his attention again. He kept his back to her, listening as she stepped out, the drip of water hitting the floor like a quiet rhythm. He grabbed a spare shirt from a crate, worn but clean, and tossed it toward her without looking. "Put that on," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. The fabric rustled as she caught it, and he waited, staring at the wall until he was sure she'd covered herself. When he turned, she stood there, the shirt hanging loose on her frame, damp at the edges where water still clung to her. Her silver skin glistened, her body no longer a shadow of weakness, but something alive, renewed. Her eyes, brighter now, met his sharp, searching, carrying a weight he couldn't decipher. Ethan shifted his weight, the floor creaking under his boots. She took a step closer, her bare feet silent against the metal, and the air between them thickened with the scent of wet earth and warmth. He cleared his throat, reaching for the canteen to refill it, his hands moving on instinct as her gaze followed him, steady and unyielding. Ethan lingered by the workbench, the empty canteen cool against his palm as he watched her breathe beneath the blanket. The station's dim light cast long shadows across her silver form, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm too fragile to trust. The air buzzed with the faint hum of the heater, steam drifting from the pipes like ghosts of a forgotten time. He couldn't stop here, not with her still coated in the wasteland's filth, her body a testament to whatever hell she'd escaped. The rag had been a start, but it wasn't enough. She deserved more, something to pull her back from the edge, and he'd be damned if he didn't try. He set the canteen down and moved to a control panel bolted to the wall, its surface pitted with rust. With a flick of his wrist, he activated the water system, a low groan vibrating through the station as it coughed to life. He'd built the bath himself years ago, a shallow basin salvage from filtration unit, patched with scrap metal and stubborn ingenuity. It sat in a corner near the heater, half hidden by a stack of crates, and he dragged it out now, the screech of metal on metal cutting through the quiet. Steam rose as he poured hot water from a jury-rigged tank, the surface shimmering with heat. He dipped his fingers in, wincing at the scalding touch, then tempered it with a splash of cold from a secondary line. It wasn't much, but it was warm, clean, and ready. He turned to her, his boots scuffing the floor. She hadn't moved, her face half buried in the blanket, but the silver of her skin peeked out, glinting faintly. "Hey," he said, his voice low and rough, softened by the steam-filled air. "I've got water. It'll help you feel better." She didn't respond, her lashes still against her cheeks, but he knelt beside the cot anyway, resting a hand on her arm. Her skin was warmer now, smooth beneath his rough fingers, and the contact sent a quiet ripple through him. He shook her gently, and her eyes fluttered open, bright, almost blinding in their intensity, piercing through the haze to meet his. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, caught in that gaze like a man staring into a storm. She shifted, pushing herself up with arms that trembled under the effort. The blanket slipped, revealing the tattered remnants of her clothes, shreds that clung to her frame, barely covering the curves of her body. Ethan looked away, a flush creeping up his neck, and pointed toward the basin. "It's there," he muttered, stepping back to give her room. She rose unsteadily, her movements slow but deliberate, and he kept his distance, sensing the weight of her need for autonomy. She reached the bath, her fingers brushing the edge as if testing its warmth, then let the rags fall away, the fabric pooling at her feet in a silent surrender. Ethan busied himself with a loose bolt on the workbench, his back to her, but the sound of water broke his focus. She stepped into the basin, sinking into it with a grace that defied her frailty, and the water lapped against her silver skin, washing away the grime in slow, dark streams. A soft moan slipped from her lips, barely a whisper, but it struck Ethan like a live wire. It was pure, unguarded relief, a sound that spoke of safety after endless nights of fear. Then the tears came, quiet at first, spilling down her cheeks as she hugged her knees. The sobs grew, raw and jagged, shaking her shoulders as the warmth wrapped around her, a shield against the cold that had defined her world. Her cries sliced through him, unearthing pain he'd buried deep. He saw his sister's face again, frozen in the wreckage, her voice lost to the wind. He saw the soldiers he'd failed, their hands reaching for him in the dark. Each sob was a mirror to his own regrets, a reminder of every life he couldn't save. His grip tightened on the bolt, the metal biting into his palm, and he forced himself to stay rooted. She didn't need him looming over her, didn't need his grief muddying hers. This was her space, her moment to claw back something the universe had stolen, and he wouldn't intrude. He traced the bolt's edges with his thumb, the familiar texture grounding him as her sobs echoed in the steam. But the air grew thicker, the steam weaving a veil between them, and his resolve wavered. He glanced back, just for a heartbeat, and the sight stole the air from his lungs. Through the haze, her form glowed, water tracing the arch of her spine, the gentle swell of her hips, her silver skin shimmering like molten starlight. She leaned back, letting the warmth seep into her, and the vulnerability of it, the quiet trust in that act, tightened his chest. His heart pounded, a heavy thud against his ribs, and the room shrank around him, the heat pressing in until it felt like a living thing. He tore his gaze away, a curse slipping under his breath, and dragged a hand over his face. She was a survivor, not some vision for him to linger on, but the image clung to him, a spark he couldn't douse. She stayed in the water longer than he'd anticipated, the surface growing still as her tears subsided. The slosh of it broke the silence when she finally stirred, and Ethan kept his back turned, listening to the drip of water on metal. He reached for a spare shirt, faded but clean, from a crate and tossed it toward her without looking. "Put that on," he said, his voice rougher than he meant, edged with the strain of keeping himself in check. The fabric rustled as she caught it, and he waited, staring at a crack in the wall until the sound of her movement settled. When he turned, she stood there, the shirt hanging loose on her frame, damp where water still clung to her skin. Her silver body gleamed, no longer dulled by weakness but alive with a quiet strength. Her eyes, sharper now, locked onto his, searching, carrying a depth that pulled at him in ways he couldn't name. Ethan shifted, the floor groaning under his weight as she took a step closer. Her bare feet made no sound, but the air carried her scent, wet earth and something faintly sweet, mixing with the steam. He cleared his throat, bending to adjust the heater's valve, his fingers fumbling slightly as her gaze lingered, steady and unblinking, on the back of his neck. Ethan twisted the heater's valve, the faint hiss of steam softening as the pressure eased. The silver-skinned woman stood a few steps away, her presence a quiet weight in the room, her damp shirt clinging to her frame. He straightened, brushing his hands on his pants, and caught her gaze, those bright, unyielding eyes tracking his every move. She didn't speak, hadn't since he'd found her, but the silence between them was shifting, growing heavier with something he couldn't quite place. He turned to the workbench, picking up a wrench to give his hand something to do, but the air still carried her scent, wet earth and a sweetness that lingered like a memory he couldn't grasp. Days passed in the station, marked by the hum of machinery and the flicker of the overhead light. She stayed, and Ethan didn't push her to leave. He'd expected her to fade, to collapse under whatever had broken her out there, but she didn't. She grew stronger, her steps steadier, her silver skin losing the dull sheen of exhaustion. One morning, as he wrestled with a jammed generator coil, she appeared beside him, her fingers hovering over the tangle of wires. He glanced at her, ready to wave her off, but she reached in before he could protest, deftly prying a rusted pin loose with a precision that made him pause. The coil sprang free, and he stared, the wrench slack in his hand. "You know machines," he said, more to himself than to her. She didn't answer, just tilted her head, her eyes glinting with a spark of something, pride, maybe, or amusement. He handed her a screwdriver, testing her, and she took it without hesitation, twisting it into the generator's casing with a practiced ease. Her movements were quick, deliberate, her slender fingers navigating the mess of bolts and gears like she'd done it 1,000 times. Ethan watched, his surprise deepening into something else. Respect, grudging at first, then genuine. She wasn't just a victim he'd dragged in from the rubble. She had skills, a mind of her own, and that realization chipped away at the walls he'd built around himself. They fell into a rhythm after that, working side by side in the cluttered station. He'd point to a tool, she'd fetch it. He'd grunt at a stubborn panel, she'd slide and loosen it. The generator hummed back to life under their hands, its steady pulse a quiet victory in the wasteland silence. Ethan found himself talking as they worked. Not much, just muttered instructions or gruff explanations about the station's quirks, but it was more than he'd said to anyone in years. She listened, her head cocked slightly, absorbing his words without reply. It should have felt one-sided, but it didn't. Her presence filled the gaps, her quiet competence a language he was starting to understand. One afternoon, as he wrestled with a fuel pump's clogged filter, she stepped up with a thin metal rod, offering it to him. Their hands brushed as he took it, her silver skin cool against his knuckles, and the touch lingered, longer than it should have, longer than he'd meant it to. He froze, the rod halfway to the pump, and glanced at her. Her eyes sparkled, a flicker of mischief dancing in their depths, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. It wasn't innocent, that look, it was deliberate, teasing, and it sent a jolt through him, a heat that pooled low in his gut. He pulled his hand back, focusing on the pump with more force than necessary, but the air between them crackled, charged with something he couldn't ignore. She didn't let it drop. As they worked, her movements grew bolder, leaning closer when she handed him a wrench, her arm grazing his as she adjusted a gear. Each touch was fleeting, deliberate, a brush of fingers or a nudge of her shoulder that left him hyper-aware of her. He tried to dismiss it, to chalk it up to the station's cramped quarters, but the truth gnawed at him. She was testing him, pushing at the edges of his restraint, and he wasn't sure how long he could pretend it didn't affect him. His heart thudded harder each time, his hands fumbling more than they should, and he cursed himself for it. She was a survivor, a partner now, not some distraction. Yet the way she moved, the way she looked at him, made that line blur. The connection deepened without words, a silent thread weaving through their days. One evening, he was hunched over a control box, its wiring a mess of frayed ends and burnt circuits. The station's light buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows across the floor. She came up behind him, her presence a sudden warmth at his back, and he stiffened as her breath grazed his neck. It was soft, barely there, but it hit him like a shockwave, raising the hairs on his skin. Her hand settled lightly on his shoulder, her fingers pressing just enough to guide him toward a loose connection he'd missed. The touch was steady, purposeful, but it lingered, her palm warm through his shirt, and the air thickened around them, heavy with a tension that prickled his senses. He didn't move, didn't dare turn, his hands gripping the pliers as her breath brushed his nape again, slow, deliberate, a whisper of heat that made his pulse race. She stayed there, her body close enough that he could feel the faint hum of her energy, her silver skin radiating a quiet strength. The station's steam curled upward, blending with the warmth of her nearness, and for a moment, he forgot the wires, forgot the repair, lost in the pull of her. Her fingers slid down his shoulder, a gentle retreat, but the sensation lingered, a ghost of contact that left him unsteady. He exhaled sharply, forcing his focus back to the box, but the air still buzzed with her presence, the space between them alive with something unspoken. She stepped away after that, moving to a shelf to sort through a pile of spare parts, her movements casual as if nothing had happened. Ethan watched her from the corner of his eye, the pliers trembling slightly in his grip. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a force, a mirror to parts of himself he'd forgotten. Her skill, her quiet defiance, her unexpected warmth. They were pulling him out of the shell he'd lived in for too long. He'd always seen himself as the one saving her, but now he wondered if it wasn't the other way around. The thought settled in him, heavy and unfamiliar, as he twisted a wire into place. They worked late into the night, the station's hum a steady backdrop to their shared silence. She handed him a bolt, her fingers brushing his again, and this time he didn't flinch, just met her gaze, her eyes glinting with that same teasing spark. He took the bolt, his thumb grazing her skin by accident, and the heat flared once more, a quiet pulse between them. She didn't pull away, just stood there, watching him with a look that dared him to acknowledge it. He didn't, not yet, turning back to the control box instead, but the weight of her stare stayed with him, a thread tugging at the edges of his resolve. The generator sparked as he tightened the last connection, a faint glow flickering to life on its display. She stepped closer, peering over his shoulder, her breath warm against his ear as she inspected the work. Ethan kept his hands on the panel, his fingers tracing the edge of it, the station's heat curling around them both as the night stretched on. Ethan's fingers lingered on the control panel, tracing its worn edges as the generator's faint glow pulsed in the dim station. The night stretched on, the air thick with steam and the quiet hum of machinery, but it was her presence that filled the space, her silver form moving silently beside him, her gaze a steady weight he couldn't shake. They'd worked together for hours, and the rhythm of it had settled into something familiar, something that eased the edges of his solitude. She handed him tools, adjusted wires, her hands quick and sure, and he'd stopped questioning how she fit so seamlessly into his world. But beneath the routine, something simmered, a thread of connection growing tighter with each passing day. The fire came later, a small blaze he built in a scavenged metal drum near the station center. The generator was stable now, its repairs holding, and the night felt softer, the wind outside muted by the walls. He'd dragged a crate over for himself, sitting with his elbows on his knees, the flickering flames casting shadows across his scarred hands. She joined him, settling on the floor beside the drum, her legs tucked beneath her. The firelight danced over her silver skin, turning it molten, and her eyes caught the glow, bright and unreadable. Ethan poked at the embers with a twisted rod, the crackle of burning scraps filling the silence. He didn't expect her to speak. She hadn't yet. But he felt her watching, her attention a quiet pull he couldn't ignore. Then she moved, her hands rising slowly, deliberate. She pressed her palm to her chest, fingers splaying over her heart, and held it there, her gaze dropping to the fire. Ethan straightened, the rod stilling in his grip as he watched her. Her other hand slid down her side, tracing the curve of her ribs, then her waist, a gesture that carried weight beyond its simplicity. Her eyes flicked up, meeting his, and the pain in them hit him like a blow, raw, deep, a wound that hadn't healed. She clenched her fist against her chest, her knuckles whitening, then opened it sharply, as if releasing something or someone. Her lips parted, a silent breath escaping, and she pointed outward beyond the station, her arm trembling slightly. He didn't need words to understand. She was telling him something, her story, her past, through the language of her body. Her hands moved again, faster now, painting a picture in the air. She mimed a weapon, her grip tight and steady, then slashed it downward, her face hardening with a fierceness he hadn't seen before. A warrior, he realized, his breath catching. She'd fought, survived battles he could only imagine. But then her shoulders sagged, her hands falling to her lap, and she pressed them together, twisting them as if bound. Betrayal. The words settled in his mind, heavy and certain. She'd been left behind, abandoned by those she'd trusted, and the firelight flickered in her eyes as they shimmered with unshed tears. Ethan's chest tightened, the rod slipping from his fingers to clatter against the drum. Her story echoed his own, too close, too familiar. He saw his squad again, their faces flashing in the flames, the moment he'd turned back to find them gone, swallowed by the war he couldn't stop. The guilt had never left him, a shadow that clung to every breath, and now it roared to life, mirrored in her silent grief. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a reflection of his own scars, a reminder of the lives he'd failed to protect. His hands flexed, itching to reach for her, to shield her from a past he couldn't change. He'd pulled her from the rubble, but this was deeper, a wound he understood too well. She shifted then, leaning toward him, her body curling closer to the fire's warmth. Her shoulder brushed his knee, and before he could pull back, she pressed herself against him, her head resting on his chest. The suddenness of it froze him, her silver skin warm through his shirt, her breath soft against his collarbone. A shiver ran down his spine, not from cold but from the heat of her, the way it seeped into him, steady and alive. His arm hovered, uncertain, then settled around her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Her skin was smooth under his fingers, softer than he'd imagined, and the contact sent a quiet tremor through him, a warmth that spread from his palm to his core. He didn't move, didn't dare disrupt the moment. Her weight against him was solid, grounding, and her scent, earthy, sweet, mingled with the smoke, filling his lungs. His fingers brushed her shoulder, a slow, unintentional glide, and the sensation deepened, tender yet charged, like a current running beneath his skin. She didn't pull away, just nestled closer, her hair spilling over his arm, dark strands catching the fire's glow. The station faded around them, the hum of machinery a distant murmur, and for a moment, it was just the two of them, two broken souls finding solace in the quiet. Her breathing slowed, the tension easing from her frame, and Ethan stared into the flames, his mind a tangle of memory and feeling. She'd trusted him with her story, laid it bare without a word, and it stirred something in him, something protective, fierce, a need to keep her safe that went beyond the instinct to save. His hand tightened slightly on her shoulder, anchoring her to him, and he felt her relax further, her warmth a steady pulse against his chest. He'd spent years shutting out the world, but she was slipping through the cracks, her presence a light he hadn't known he needed. The fire crackled, a log shifting in the drum, and she lifted her head slightly, her eyes finding his again. They were clearer now, the pain still there but softened, layered with a strength that took his breath away. She didn't move away, just held his gaze, her face close enough that he could see the faint shimmer of her skin in the flickering light. His hand stayed on her shoulder, his thumb brushing the edge of her collarbone, and the air between them thickened, warm and heavy with the weight of what they'd shared. He swallowed, his throat tight, and reached for the rod again, stirring the embers as her head settled back against him, her fingers curling lightly against his side. Ethan stirred the embers one last time, the fire's glow fading as Rinna's warmth lingered against his side. Her head had settled back on his chest, her fingers curling lightly against him, and the weight of her story hung in the air. Betrayal, resilience, a past she'd laid bare without words. He'd held her there, his arm around her shoulders, until the station's hum overtook the crackle of the flames, the nights stretching long and quiet around them. Eventually, she'd shifted away, her silver form moving with a quiet grace to the cot across the room, leaving him by the drum with the echo of her closeness still thrumming in his chest. He stayed a moment longer, staring into the dying fire, then stood, his boots scuffing the metal floor as he crossed to the station's cracked window. His breath fogged faintly in the cool night air as he looked out, the jagged ruins of Sector 13 stretching into the distance beneath a sky heavy with clouds. The dull gray veil swallowed the stars, leaving only the faint drone of machinery to fill the silence. But inside, the air was warmer, thick with the damp heat of steam curling from the pipes overhead. She'd changed this place, softened its edges with her presence, and he could feel her behind him now. Rinna, a quiet constant in the life they'd begun to carve out together. He turned from the window, wiping his hands on his grease-stained pants, and saw her across the room, perched on a crate near the workbench. She sat with her legs crossed, her silver fingers tracing the edge of a rusted bolt she'd been fiddling with, her dark hair spilling over one shoulder. The overhead light flickered, casting jagged shadows over her frame, and the faint glow caught her skin, turning it molten in the dimness. She wore his shirt still, the fabric loose and worn, its hem brushing her thighs as she shifted slightly, her movements fluid and deliberate. Ethan's chest tightened, not just at her beauty, though that was undeniable, but at the way she fit here, a piece of his world he hadn't known he'd needed since the night she'd pressed against him by the fire. Days had slipped into weeks since that moment, their rhythm growing steady, layered with a quiet intimacy that crept up on him. They moved through the station together, a tandem born of necessity that had softened into something more. He'd be elbow-deep in a busted coolant line, grease smearing his forearms, and she'd appear with a wrench, her silver hands steady as she tightened a fitting he couldn't reach. At dusk, they'd sit by the workbench, sharing a meal he'd scraped together from rations. Thin stew simmered over the heater, steam rising in lazy curls. She'd take the spoon from him, her fingers brushing his, and eat with a focus that made him wonder about the life she'd left behind, the flavors she'd once known. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full, woven with glances and gestures, a language they'd built without words. The trust had taken root, deep and unspoken, sinking into the cracks of his guarded heart. He'd catch himself watching her, not just her hands on a circuit or her eyes on the fire, but her, the way she moved, the way she carried herself, strong yet soft, a survivor who'd chosen to stay. It wasn't about saving her anymore. That instinct had faded, replaced by something richer, a companionship that felt like friendship, then edged into a territory he hadn't dared name. She wasn't a burden he'd taken on. She was a partner, a presence that filled the hollow spaces he'd lived with too long. And he could see it in her too, the way her shoulders relaxed when he was near, the way her gaze lingered, steady and sure, a mirror to the quiet shift inside him. Tonight, the station's light buzzed faintly, its amber glow casting long shadows across the walls. Ethan stood by the basin, scrubbing a pot with a rag, the water's heat seeping into his hands and easing the ache of the day's labor. His muscles burned, a dull reminder of hours spent wrestling machinery back to life, and the quiet was a balm, broken only by the soft clink of metal as Rinna sorted tools across the room. He didn't hear her approach, didn't notice her until she was there. Close, her silver skin catching the faint light, her shirt loose and worn from days of wear. She stopped in front of him, her eyes bright, searching, and the air shifted, heavy with a tension that prickled his skin. She reached out, her hand closing around his wrist, and pulled it from the water with a gentle insistence. His breath caught as she guided his damp fingers to her waist, pressing them there, the thin fabric of her shirt a flimsy barrier to the warmth radiating from her. Ethan froze, the rag slipping from his other hand to splash into the basin, the sound sharp in the stillness. She stepped closer, her body inches from his, and tilted her head, her face so near he could feel the faint stir of her breath against his jaw. Her lips hovered, soft and parted, and then she closed the distance, kissing him with a slowness that unraveled him, a tenderness laced with something deeper, something raw that set his nerves alight. The kiss was a spark, igniting a fire he hadn't known was waiting. Her mouth was warm, soft against his, and he tasted the faint sweetness of her, earthy, alive, a flavor that sank into him. He hesitated only a heartbeat before responding, his hand tightening on her waist, pulling her closer as the world narrowed to the feel of her. She pressed herself against him, her silver skin a contrast to his rough edges, and they stumbled backward, the station's shadows swallowing them whole. His back hit the wall with a muffled thud, and she followed, her hands sliding up his chest, fingers tugging at his shirt with a quiet urgency that sent heat racing through his veins. They sank into the darkness, the cot catching them as they fell together, a tangle of limbs and breath in the dimness. His hands roamed her waist, slipping beneath the fabric to trace the curve of her hips, her silver skin warm and smooth against his calloused palms. She pulled him closer, her breath hitching against his lips, a soft, unguarded sound that drove him deeper into her orbit. The air thickened with the scent of steam and her sweetness, their bodies molding together in a rhythm that drowned out the station's hum. Her fingers slid beneath his shirt, brushing his skin with a teasing lightness before tugging it higher, and he yielded, letting her peel it away as the heat between them flared. Later, tangled in the blanket, Ethan exhaled sharply, his chest heaving as her silver form pressed against his side, her warmth lingering like a pulse in the quiet, her earthy scent clinging to the air. She stayed there, curled into him on the narrow cot, her head resting on his chest as the shadows danced across the walls. Her fingers traced lazy circles across his bare skin, following the rise and fall of his breath, and he looked down at her, her eyes catching the faint light. Mischievous, yes, but softened with a comfort he hadn't seen before, an ease that mirrored the quiet in his own chest. She was different now, bolder in her stillness, and he felt it too, the shift in her, in them. Her touch was playful yet tender, her fingers circling a scar on his chest, then sliding lower, teasing without pushing. He caught her hand, holding it against him, and she smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips that made his pulse jump. She nestled closer, her leg brushing his, and the warmth of her seeped into him, steady and sure. He'd spent years alone, guarding himself against the world, building walls she'd slipped through with every glance, every touch. Now, he didn't want to push her away, not anymore. The station's light flickered again, a brief stutter that threw their shadows across the wall, and she lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. The spark was still there, playful, daring, but layered with something deeper, something that held him fast. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb grazing her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, her silver skin warm under his fingers. The cot creaked beneath them, the blanket still tangled at their feet, and he shifted to pull it higher, his arms settling around her as the night stretched on, the station's hum a quiet backdrop to their shared silence. Ethan pulled the blanket higher, his arms settling around Rinna as the station's hum filled the quiet night. Her warmth pressed into him, her head resting on his chest, and the weight of her felt like an anchor, solid, real, a tether to something he hadn't known he'd been missing. The cot was narrow, the blanket rough against his skin, but her presence softened it all, her silver skin faintly glowing in the dim light. She'd fallen asleep eventually, her breathing slow and even, and he'd stayed awake, staring at the ceiling as the flicker of the station's bulb traced patterns in the dark. The moment they'd shared lingered in his bones, a quiet shift he couldn't unfeel, and he wondered what it meant for them now. Days slipped by, their routine steady but charged with a new undercurrent. She moved through the station with a confidence he hadn't seen before, her hands quick on the tools, her steps sure on the metal floor. He'd catch her watching him sometimes, not with the wariness of those early days, but with a clarity that made his pulse jump. The air between them was different, heavier, woven with the memory of her lips on his, her body against him in the shadows. He didn't push it, didn't ask for more, but it was there, a thread pulling tighter with every glance, every brush of her hand. One evening, he found her standing by a cracked mirror he'd salvaged months ago, propped against the wall near the workbench. She wore his shirt still, the fabric loose on her frame, its hem brushing her thighs. The station's light was dim, but it caught her silver skin, turning it luminous as she studied her reflection. Ethan paused, a wrench in his hand, watching her from across the room. She tilted her head, her dark hair spilling over one shoulder, and ran her hands down her sides, slowly, deliberately, tracing the lines of her body. Her fingers lingered at her waist, then rose to her chest, pressing there as if feeling her own heartbeat. Her eyes, bright and fierce, met her own in the glass, and a quiet strength settled over her, a certainty that hadn't been there before. He knew what it meant. She wasn't the broken figure he'd pulled from the rubble anymore, not the lost soul clinging to survival. She stood taller, her gaze steady, her silver skin a testament to a resilience she'd reclaimed. This wasn't about needing him to save her. It was about choosing something more, a life, a place, a beginning she could shape. Ethan's chest tightened, a mix of pride and something softer, something that ached with the weight of her transformation. She'd been abandoned once, left to fade in Sector 13's wasteland. But here, in this crumbling station, she was building herself anew. And she was doing it with him. She turned then, her eyes finding his across the room, and the air shifted, warm, alive with intent. She crossed the space between them, her bare feet silent on the floor, and stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel the heat of her. Ethan set the wrench down, his hands flexing at his sides, and she reached out, her fingers curling around his wrist. She pulled his hand to her waist, pressing it there as she had that night, her touch firm and sure. He didn't resist, couldn't, as she stepped closer, her body brushing his. She tilted her face up, her lips hovering near his, and then she kissed him, deeply, deliberately, a slow burn that unraveled him from the inside. He sank into it, his hand tightening on her waist, pulling her against him as the kiss deepened. Her mouth was warm, insistent, and he tasted that faint sweetness again, earthy and alive. She pressed herself closer, her hands sliding up his chest, fingers threading into his hair, tugging gently as she molded herself to him. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, and their breaths mingled, heavy, warm, a rhythm that drowned out the station's hum. Her silver skin was a contrast to his roughness, her body soft yet strong, and the closeness was electric, a pulse of emotion that went beyond words. They stayed like that, locked together, the world fading to the heat of their embrace. Her fingers tightened in his hair, her breath hitching against his lips, and he felt her strength, her choice, in every touch. When the kiss softened, she didn't pull away, just rested her forehead against his, her hands sliding to his shoulders. He held her, his arms steady around her, and whispered into the quiet, "I want you to stay." His voice was rough, low, but it carried everything he hadn't said, the need, the hope, the truth of what she'd become to him. She lifted her head, her eyes meeting his, and a smile curved her lips, small, real, lighting up her face with a warmth that mirrored his own. She stepped back slightly, her hands still on his shoulders, and he let his fingers trail down her arms, reluctant to let go. The station's light buzzed faintly, casting their shadows long across the floor, and she moved to the workbench, picking up the wrench he dropped. She turned it over in her hands, her silver fingers glinting as she studied it, her smile lingering as she glanced back at him. Rinna turned the wrench over in her hands, her silver fingers glinting as the station's faint light danced across them. She stood by the workbench, the tool of familiar weight from their shared days, and Ethan watched her from across the room, his own smile lingering, a quiet echo of hers that warmed the edges of his chest. The air still carried the charge of their kiss from moments before, her decision to stay sealed in the way she'd pressed against him, her lips fierce and sure. She set the wrench down, her movements deliberate, and crossed the space to join him, her presence settling into the station like it had always belonged there. The hum of machinery buzzed softly around them, a steady drone that underscored the life they were building piece by piece in Sector 13's shadow. Weeks had unfolded since that night by the mirror, slipping into a rhythm of calm Ethan hadn't known he could find. The station's walls, once cold and unyielding, now held the echo of their footsteps, their laughter, soft, rare, but real. They moved through the days together, their hands brushing over tools as they patched the station's endless quirks, their shoulders bumping in the cramped quarters. Mornings found them side by side at the workbench, sunlight filtering through the cracked window to gild her silver skin, turning it luminous against the dull metal around them. He'd catch her eye as they worked, her gaze steady and bright, and something would pass between them, unspoken, warm, a thread that tightened with every shared glance. Evenings drew them closer, the station's dimness softening the world beyond its walls. They'd sit by the fire drum, the flames casting flickering shadows across her face as she leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. He'd wrap an arm around her, his hand sliding down her back, tracing the curve of her spine through the worn fabric of a shirt she still wore, a piece of him she'd claimed as her own. She'd shift, her body fitting against his, and the closeness was a balm, soothing the scars they both carried, the jagged edges of their past smoothed by the quiet they'd found together. The fire's warmth mingled with hers, and he'd feel her breath against his neck, steady and soft, a reminder of the life they'd stitched from the ruins. They'd become a haven for each other, a sanctuary amid the wasteland's threats. Beyond the station, Sector 13 loomed, its broken towers clawing at the sky, a constant reminder of a world that could turn hostile in an instant. Ethan knew it wasn't safe, not truly. The wind carried the faint howl of war's echoes, and scavengers roamed the edges of their refuge, their shadows fleeting in the distance. But inside, with her, the danger felt distant, muted by the strength they'd forged. She was his calm, her steady gaze a shield against the memories that once clawed at him. His squad, his failures, the screams he couldn't silence. And he was hers, his presence an anchor for the warrior who'd been abandoned, a promise she wouldn't face the dark alone again. Their nights grew softer, the station's shadows wrapping them in a cocoon of their own making. One evening, the air hung thick with the scent of steam and rust, the light flickering as they sat on the cot, knees brushing in the quiet. Ethan leaned back against the wall, his hands resting on his thighs, the day's work still heavy in his bones. Rinna shifted beside him, her eyes glinting with that familiar spark, playful yet deep, a look that stirred him every time. She moved suddenly, climbing onto his lap with a grace that caught him off guard, her legs straddling his as she settled against him. His breath hitched, his hands finding her waist on instinct, and she smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that sent heat racing through him. She leaned in, her hands sliding beneath his shirt, fingers brushing his skin with a teasing lightness before tugging at the fabric with a quiet urgency. The kiss was long, deliberate, a slow burn that deepened with every second, her mouth warm and insistent against his. He responded, his hands tightening on her hips, slipping beneath the shirt to trace her silver curves as their breaths mingled. Heavy, warm, a rhythm that drowned out the station's hum. The cot creaked as they fell back, her body a blur of silver against him, and the air thickened with her earthy sweetness, wrapping around them like a shroud. Her fingers pulled at his shirt, peeling it away as he yielded to her touch, and the heat between them flared, raw and alive. Later, tangled in the blanket, Ethan exhaled sharply, his chest heaving as she rested beside him, her silver skin pressed to his, her fingers tracing lazy circles on his chest in the misty light. They stayed like that, the world shrinking to the space between them, her heartbeat steady against his side. His hand slid up her back, brushing the bare edge of her silver skin where the shirt had ridden up, and she sighed, a soft, contented sound that settled into him like a promise. Days later, they stood by the station's window, the cracked glass framing Sector 13's desolate expanse. The sky was a bruise of gray and orange, the horizon jagged with the husks of forgotten towers. Ethan's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining, and she squeezed gently, her silver skin cool against his calloused palm. They didn't speak, didn't need to, their eyes tracing the wasteland together, a shared gaze that held more than words could carry. Her shoulder brushed his, her warmth a constant beside him, and he felt the depth of their companionship in that touch, a bond forged through ruin, strong enough to face whatever lay ahead. She turned her head, her eyes meeting his, and the light caught them, bright, fierce, alive with a strength that mirrored his own. He saw it then, clear as the dawn. She was his equal, his partner, a woman who'd chosen him as he'd chosen her. The world outside could wait, its threats a distant murmur against the life they'd built. They stood there, hand in hand, the wind rattling the window pane as it carried the faint groan of Sector 13's ghosts. Whatever came next, danger, discovery, or the slow grind of survival, they'd meet it together, two souls bound by a quiet, unyielding promise, etched in silver and scars.